Hello again. Today I'd like to talk about some of the techniques that I use to generate and modulate sequences, sometimes quite unusual ways. But without further ado, let's dive in. Now, the first technique we're going to look at is called an external trigger reset, and that's exactly what it does. It takes your normal 8-step sequence, which is what we're looking at here, and it resets it. Now, the way it resets it, I've got a separate trigger sequencer here, and that's outputting 3 different triggers. Now, the first trigger sequence is 13 steps long, the second is 11, the third is 14 steps long. And each of these is being fed into a Boolean logic gate. And the output is coming from exclusive OR and is triggering the reset button. Now, what that means is exclusive OR produces a trigger when A or B or C trigger. But the difference between OR and exclusive OR is that when 2 or more trigger, you don't get a trigger. If you just use ordinary OR, then when any of them trigger, whether it's one, if it's individual, or whether it's 2 or 3, then you don't get a trigger. The exclusive OR does not trigger when 2 or more trigger. So that generates interesting little patterns. Now, I'd like to hear what it sounds like. Now, at the moment, if you have a look here, you see that only one of the lights is lit. That's because we've got a single step. It's not very interesting at the moment. Now, I'll turn up the number of steps. We now have 2 steps, and I hope you can hear that while the first step plays regularly, the second step triggers, but not every time. And it's more obvious as we move on to the third step. And what's happening is, every time there's a trigger from the logic gate, it resets. You can see that here, the light coming on in the reset button. So it'll reset back to the start. So what you get is a 3-step sequence where it's not moving sequentially, it's being continually reset back to step 1. And as we take it to 4 steps, it gets reset the same way, which means it doesn't always reach step 4. I'll take it up to what's now up at 8 steps. And I hope you can hear what's going on there. You have this very interesting, non-repetitive 8-step sequence where you can't predict just exactly where the next note is going to fall. And of course, as usual in my particular style, I'll turn down the probability in the Bernoulli gate. So we're now not firing every time. So we're starting to thin out the sequence a little bit. Now, the second thing we're going to look at involves a module called a shift register. Now, the shift register is an interesting little thing. And the way I would suggest that you think about a shift register is perhaps the way you might think of Frere Jacques, because a shift register operates like a round. Now, what we have here is the shift register. Now, the shift register is being triggered and it's being fed a note. If we take the trigger out, obviously, it just stops. If we take the note out, it just remains on the level. Now, I'm going to take the second one out. Now, what you can see here is the notes being generated. Each rise or fall is a different pitch. I'm going to put the second cable in, and what we get is the second pitch sequence. Now, I don't know if you can see this, but if you have a look there, the pitch sequence repeats itself, but one step off. So wherever you look, there's a long part there and it's repeated there, or there's a low part here which is repeated there and then it goes higher. So these are the pitches. They're always repeated one step off. If I take the cable down to the third one, what we're getting now is, for example, this pitch being repeated 2 steps later. And now we're getting this pitch repeated 3 steps later, and so on. And that's the idea of a sequential switch. Now, one of the good things that I find about a sequential switch is if you have multiple oscillators, or even a dual oscillator, and what you can do is you can send these pitches to different oscillators. Now, I have different oscillators to the right here, but I won't bother showing you them, but I'll give you an idea of what's precisely is happening. The trigger and the note output from the quantizer and the Bernoulli gate, of course, are fed into the shift register. Now, the first output of the shift register goes to the note input. The fourth output of the shift register goes to the second oscillator's pitch input, and the sixth output goes to the third oscillator's pitch envelope. So what you tend to find is that you get notes being repeated, but several steps later, and using a different voice. And that's the idea, the Frere-Jacquet idea. So I'll let you hear how this sounds. And again, currently it's not very interesting because, as before, there's only one note being played. There's only one note, the first note of the sequence, this top line here. And the first note of the sequence is the only note that's being played. So therefore all the voices are playing the same note. Now if I turn that to 2 steps, and that's only 2 notes playing. And if I turn it up to 3, I hope you can hear that we are getting a repetitive sequence, but it's out of sync. And up to 4 and 5. To me, that's a very interesting 5-step sequence. And if you're interested to know the way this particular shift register works, the green notes are those above middle C, and the red notes are those below middle C. So at the moment the sequence has a preponderance of green notes because there's only one note. This note here is below C, middle C. So I'll take it up the full way. And that's us now cycling through the 8 notes of the top row of the sequencer. All well and good, but as you can hear, although it's more interesting, it does become repetitive fairly quickly. So, what can we do about that? Well, in the next one, I've added a little bit of randomness. And that's in this module here, the random module. And what's happening here is this one will output, well, I'll show you. Well, here we are. Same basic idea, same shift register, same single note. Let's turn up. And we're now getting the 8-step sequence, which is similar, but not exactly the same as the one before. But it does sound similar. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add in a random note generated from this particular module. At the moment the probability is 0, so therefore there is no note being added. Now when you add notes, of course, you're going to add or subtract the pitches depending on the relationship between them. So this will expand the range a little of the sequence. So I'm now going to increase this probability. And just by increasing the probability a bit and then taking it back down again, what you get is a new repetitive sequence. And you notice it's not firing, and there it did. And we get a new repetitive sequence until it fires. Now, if we increase the probability, then every time the probability fires, it changes the sequence around. There's a definite connection between the original and the new one, but it's not immediately obvious. Now, I've set it up on the scope over here. You can see this is the output of the probability, and this is the effect it's having on the pitch of the note. So you can see when it's going high, the overall pitch is going higher, and when it goes low, the overall pitch drops quite considerably, because we're dealing here with, if you like, positive and negative values of pitches. So the pitch can go, as you can see there, very low, it almost disappeared, into very bass regions. And then we are low again, but it'll go high sooner or later. So that is how to generate repetitive but evolving sequences simply by adding a little bit of probability. I'll take the probability down, and we're just going to be left with this 8-step sequence again. So there are 3 voices going on here, so the sequence actually has a little bit of interest to it, and you can modulate the 3 voices through a mixer and let the sound evolve as well. Now, another interesting thing is that you can add pads and you can play chords. Now this is exactly the same setup as the last time, but this time I've enabled polyphony. Now in VCV, what you do is you merge monophonic cables into a polyphonic merger, which you then feed as a chord to your synth. So at the moment it's just playing a very simple pattern. And the very simple pattern is the same note over and over, because yet again in the sequence we're only using one step. But it's a very interesting, well, to my ears anyway, it's a very interesting drone sound. Now I'm going to open up the sequencer. So now we're on 8 steps. And you can hear the drone changing and becoming polyphonic. But yet again, we can change that by adding a little bit of probability. So although it's not vastly different because the notes are only changing very slowly, you can hear undercurrents. Of the changing pitches. Now if I bring in the previous sequence, and some drums. So that's how the shift register works. The next thing I'd like to look at involves sequencing using LFOs. And this is a kind of unusual idea and doesn't always produce predictable, it certainly doesn't produce predictable results, but it does generate some interesting results. So let's have a little look at what's going on here. We have a wavetable LFO. Now, the reason I'm using this is simply because as you can see, it allows the visualization of the waveform morphing. So you've got a sine through a triangle, through a saw, and into a square, and the evolution in between. So I find that quite useful. Now, what this is doing is it's generating, well, we'll see in a minute. If I turn the frequency up, nothing's happening. The reason nothing's happening is because the clock's not switched on. So let's see what happens when we switch the clock on. Now, the LFO goes through a sample and hold. The sample and hold is gated by the ever-present Bernoulli gate, which is clocked over here. The wavetable is fed in and it's sampled. Now, it's kind of easy to see there. What we have is a sine wave, and what we have over here on the scope is the sampled version of a sine wave with all the steps in between. If we change the frequency, it has less and less chance to sample on each cycle, and so we end up with a series of almost square waves. And if I turn this frequency up, what's happening now is it's sampling not every cycle, but jumping between cycles and creating something not akin to FM, or akin to FM even. So we'll take it back down. I tend to find that the 12 o'clock position is about as good as it gets in terms of generating interesting sounds. And as you change the frequency, as you can see, if you lower the frequency, the wave is sampled more times on its cycle, which means that the pitch difference between each of the steps is smaller. Higher the frequency, the bigger the jump in pitches. Okay, now that's just using the sine. I'm going to change now the wavetable position. And we're now moving out of a triangle into a kind of cross between a triangle and a saw. Now we'll go straight to the saw because this is interesting. You hear that little click or jump because the saw is moving upwards, and when it reaches its peak it immediately drops back to its lowest point. Now melodically I don't think that's particularly useful. It's even less useful when it comes to a square. Although you can get some interesting sonic effects as you turn it all up. So I tend to find that when I'm using this, it's much more useful when the wave shape is again below the 12 o'clock position, which means the farthest it gets is from a sine through a triangle into a kind of cross between a triangle and a saw. So all you can really do here is change the wavetable position. Or change the frequency. Not especially interesting, so let's move on. The next one is very similar, as you see. The difference this time though is there is going to be a second LFO modulating the position of the wavetable, and it also has its own frequency and positioning. So if we turn this one up, the clock's on this time, so at least we've got a sound. Turning the frequency up, now if I take out, that's the cable removed, so there's no modulation going on. I'll put it back. You can hear immediately it's got a much more interesting timbre. And of course we can attenuate the amount of modulation. So again, turning up, turning down the frequency will increase or decrease the number of steps, number of pitches, but not especially interesting. Where it becomes interesting is when we start to modulate the modulation. So we'll change the frequency of the second LFO, which is controlling the wavetable position here. And we're currently using a sine to modulate. And as you can see, it's going from a sine through to a saw. And because it's modulating fairly quickly, getting a nice evolving timbre sound. Now I'll take it up a little bit further. And if I take up the frequency of the other LFO, and the modulating LFO, it's starting to sound a little bit like Wendy Carlos doing some of her Bach interpretations. And if I modulate the wavetable position, or change the wavetable position of the modulating LFO, again the timbres are quite interesting. The actual pitch sequences themselves are not necessarily useful, but this is it's an interesting way to generate music. So if you're interested in generative music, this is a way of doing it, although the tempo is a bit fast for generative music. So I'll bring the sequence back down again, and the modulating frequency down again, and the wavetable position back to a sine. Now, again, that's not especially interesting, and even if we pair it with the last one, this is sounding very Wendy Carlos. But if I throw in our old friend the Bernoulli gate and thin the sequences down a little bit, it makes it a little bit more interesting. I don't find that particularly useful, but I find it a fascinating technique, and I do use it from time to time to generate sequences you wouldn't otherwise get. I'll throw the drums back in. Okay, once again, on to the final technique. Now, the final technique is just a development of the previous one. This time, we have two wavetable LFOs on either side, and they're being modulated by the middle wavetable LFO. So I'd like to hear how that sounds like, or how that sounds, sorry. Again, we're only using one step. The frequency is set to 0, and as a result is not producing any pitch. But if you watch the oscilloscope, as I turn up the frequency in the first LFO, we get a pitch sequence. I'm going to turn up the frequency in the second LFO. Now, I haven't done anything yet, so you can hear the sequence evolving. If I just raise and lower the frequency of the second, or the third LFO, if you like, on the screen, but the right hand LFO, then if you look at the scope again, you see that the pitch ranges are getting further apart. Now, the other thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to modulate. At the moment, the frequency modulation is pretty low. So I'm going to modulate, sorry, not the frequency modulation, the position modulation, these position modulations here. And one of them is going to be modulated positively. The other one is going to be modulated negatively by the same LFO. So listen to what happens as I turn up the frequency. You can see the shapes moving, and they're moving against each other. Now, I could increase the amount of modulation, and you see that reflected on the screen. Now, if I increase the frequency even more, you'll see there's a lot happening now. Again, whether that's of musical interest is neither here nor there, to be honest, because it is a way of generating sequences, and again, that's with every note sounding. And if I bring everything back in from the LFO section, so there are a few techniques that I would use, and I hope you found this interesting, and I hope you found it a little bit eye-opening, because when I learned these techniques, again, as I mentioned the last time, Omri Cohen will teach you anything you want to know about VC VRAC, and he's incredibly talented at what he does. So, I hope you enjoyed that, as I said, and I hope to be invited back to talk again about some more aspects of the modular world. Now, I'm going to leave you with a little piece which is created using the patch which I have just created. Now, specifically, I'm going to use the shift register patch and the external sequencer trigger patch. I'm not going to use the LFOs because they kind of get in the way of the flow of it. So I hope you hang about long enough to listen to the piece of music that I made, and I'll see you next time, hopefully. Thanks for watching.